In this lesson, what I want to do is talk about the process of ending the American frontier. Talk about when this happens, essentially, and also the impact that ending the frontier had on American culture and society during this period. So, so far, we have looked at the society, the economy, and the governments of the period that we link to the Reconstruction period and the American Gilded Age. This lesson is going to start our examinations of some of the geographical as well as foreign policy based issues, looking first with the American frontier, and then we will think about American foreign policy. We'll talk about relations and tensions with Canada, or over Canada, shall I say, and we will talk about some of the other issues that exist in this particular period as well. So, Western expansion and the settlement of Americans on the frontier was something that was continuing and had existed and had continued since the first settlements in the early or in the late 1600s, going into the 1700s. Okay, so this is really something that has been happening for hundreds of years at this point. And so, as a result of which, the frontier had a very long historical significance and significant resonance in terms of the culture within the United States. However, when we look at the early 1890s, we would see two events which would see the closing of the American frontier in the West. The first is the 1890 US Census Bureau Declaration, because essentially what the US Census Bureau Declaration said was that they declared the West was fully settled, and so there no longer existed a frontier for people to go and settle and to find new lands. They'd reached the Pacific a bit, essentially. And so, for the first time, there was no undeveloped land available in the United States. It had already all been settled at this point. In addition to this Census Bureau, we also see the 1893 Turner thesis. Now, this was an academic historical conference paper, and it was published by an academic historian by the name of F.W. Turner, who in 1893 published this conference paper, and it was titled The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And it was a very significant thing that takes place within American culture and American history, even to this day. They said that it has a wide influence both at the time, and this particular thesis has been debated quite a lot ever since. Now, one of the things that was argued in the Turner thesis was the idea that the frontier had been deeply significant to the development of the USA, and that the availability of free land acted as a safety valve against this idea of social disharmony. Now, this is quite problematic in terms of trying to justify it among other historical events which takes place in American history, because the frontier was still open at the time of the American Civil War, and I would argue that there was quite a lot of social disharmony that existed during the American Civil War. So the lens of analysis through which you can understand American history has to be a bit more multifaceted than just this of the significant frontier. You have to also think, of course, about the impact of slavery, obviously. The difficulty of settlement led to self-reliance and independence among the good working American man and woman, and so this was considered to be part of a significant aspect of American culture and American myth. And essentially, this didn't necessarily mean that the frontier itself acted as this American myth, but rather the impact of having the frontier, having the idea of being able to rely on your independence and your self-reliance as you move west and you settle in these new lands. This is what tied into the idea of the American myth, into the idea of the American dream, which is one of many American dreams that we will see as time goes on throughout this series of lessons. So it goes to show, therefore, that there was a significant impact that would be had in ending the frontier. Now, the frontier has to end eventually, because, of course, you don't settle in the Pacific Ocean. We have to get to the end of America at some point. And so, despite the fact that we see the Census Bureau and the Turner thesis making it very conclusive in their view that there was no unoccupied areas of land and that the frontier was effectively closed, we see the fact that people were still trying to find these areas of unoccupied land. And so at this point, the Census Bureau and the Turner thesis essentially made the conclusion that the frontier was closed. Well, some people didn't actually believe that, and some people were right. There were still some little areas of the West that was unoccupied, and life on the frontier had been so harsh that some decided even just to return back to the East. So even the bits that had been previously occupied were now abandoned, owing to the fact that life on the frontier was relatively difficult to live. And so we see vast cattle ranches had been developed in the years following the Civil War. The extension of the railroads made long drives less necessary, while particularly harsh winters in 1885 and 1887 killed as many as 90% of the cattle in this area. So there was still some elements and still some important discussions to be had around the idea of the frontier. The Great Plains had become largely an area of farming land. Some large-scale farms had the ability to essentially allow for the affording of new technologies to improve this efficiency as well. So the idea that the frontier had officially ended in 1890 or 1893 as a result of the declaration of the Census Bureau or the declaration by F.W. Turner was obviously, while they were conclusive, there were still some areas that were unoccupied, either because of the fact that these were some just areas that had not been included within the Census Bureau, but also because of the fact that people had turned back east as a result of the harsh conditions, so they could actually find places to settle in the West. But by and large, by the 1890s, we see the ending of the frontier. The frontier is not something that necessarily has to be seen to have ended at a specific point in time, but over the 1890s, we see the fact that the frontier becomes significantly closing. It becomes a closing area. But it still brings into question the idea of the myth of the frontier, the idea of the frontier still being something that perpetuates, and still to this day perpetuates, a lot of American mythos. This was the idea that the USA always needed new areas to settle and to civilize. Civilize in inverted commas, I should put, given the fact that what civilize means is impose your culture over that of others. Now, this myth was something that resonated quite deeply within American history, within American culture, and within American tradition. Don't forget, the founding of America was this idea of colonizing other areas of the world. This was done by the British in their empire in America, and this is what the independence, the Wars of Independence, essentially began with. It began with the colonizing of the Americas, and then just led to the breakaway of the American colonies into their own states. And so this myth would deeply resonate with American history. And this myth also enhanced the popular entertainment industries as well. The idea of the West being seen as the quote-unquote Wild West is still something that exists within American culture, less so to this day, but still within American culture to this day. We see great movies and great novels of individuals who celebrate wars against Native Americans, who celebrate life on the Wild West, on the Western Plains, and so the ending of the frontier didn't necessarily lead to an ending of this myth. It just entered into a new realm of imperialism within the USA, and we start to see how the USA takes control of other areas of the world, and will continue to do so for many, many years to come.